Before we get started, I wish to extend a special welcome to the new Dean of the University of Cincinnati Libraries, Elizabeth Kiskady. Welcome, and welcome all to the John Burnam man himself, Classics Library at the University of Cincinnati, and its third annual August celebration, after I was due to COVID. I'm Rebecka of the library. Tonight's celebration, which is coordinated with Associate Professor, you can't hear me? Okay. With Associate Professor Susan Prince, UC Classics, is a Roman author, philosopher, and politician, Seneca the Younger, who lived in the first half of the 1st century. That is the early empire during the reign of the Claudian dynasty. The emperors of which I'm sure you're familiar, whether you're a classicist or not. The Roman imperial age began with famed Augustus, written Tiberius, and you've certainly heard of the infamous Emperor Caligula and Claudius. But Seneca's life was actually impacted by virtually all of them. And most consequentially, though, by another infamous emperor, Nero, whose tutor, advisor, and government official he became. History is full of enigmatic personalities like Seneca, who may be admired in their writings or on the battlefield, but despised in their personal dealings. Tonight's panel, with leading experts on Seneca, will explore the many seeming contradictions in the politician and philosopher, followed by music performance of graduates from UC's College Conservatory of Music, under the now veteran leadership of Yoshi Unoya, who for this occasion has chosen to perform works by Dmitri Shostakovich. And those of you who are familiar with the biography of Shostakovich can certainly appreciate the parallels with Seneca's state and their shared complex relationship to the government apparatus, to strong men like Nero and Stalin. After which, we shift gears from politics to cognition, as we have asked a group of undergraduate students to explore the philosophical school promoted by Seneca, Stoicism, sharing their experiences of having lived a modern Stoic's life for 1 week, practicing moral awareness, mindfulness, reason, and moderation, while rejecting strong emotions and ambition. To quote Professor Romm in his introduction to How to Keep Your Cool, a paraphrase on Seneca's Lindau, perhaps a reckless driver cut you off and made you slam on your brakes, or someone cut in line in front of you or stole a parking spot or a cab from under your nose. You were injured, or were you? Were you notably worse off a day or two later than before the incident occurred? Did it really matter that someone disrespected you in the way that global climate change matters, or the threat of nuclear war, or the fact that stars are collapsing into black holes in other parts of our galaxy, swallowing up everything around them? Seneca recommended taking stock at the end of each day, noting when you become irritated by something trivial. By noting his mistakes, he hoped to do better the following day. Seneca writes, "We should every night hold ourselves to account. What weakness have I mastered today? What passions opposed? What temptation resisted? What virtue acquired? Our vices will cease if they're called to daily reckoning." The Stoic Week is an actual global online phenomenon which has taken place annually and publicly since 2013. So this year it has been 10 years since it went public, beginning as a workshop of academics and psychotherapists at the University of Exeter in 2012. This year's official event is scheduled for November 6 to 12, so we conducted the experiment a bit early, giving you all the opportunity to still take part in the official Global Stoic Week. We think that Seneca is perfect for the times, not only because Stoicism or some form of it has again become quite popular, but also because of the dichotomy in Seneca's biography and thinking, where personal convictions of adhering to the Stoic doctrine of decency and kindness to others came up against the need to please a murderous dictator with severe consequences, also for Seneca himself. Before turning the microphone over to the chair of the UC Classics Department, Professor Markovich, who will introduce tonight's esteemed panel, I wish to draw your attention to an exhibition of works by and about our own Marie, both in here behind me and along the wall and in the circulation area. including a 1599 Paris Gutierrez edition, a 1610 Antwerp Lipsius 2nd edition, a 1652 Lipsius 4th edition, with engravings by Rubens of a portrait bust of Seneca and of Seneca dying in the back. On loan from Professor Peter van Minnen, recently appointed John Miller Burnam Professor of Classics, and a 1658 4-volume Elsevier Honorius edition, all early critical editions of Seneca's philosophical writings. And an incutable from 1497 of works of Tacitus, the chief source of Seneca's biography, and an original Roman copper coin of Emperor Nero, and much, much more, and works by Panelists as well. Like past office celebrations, tonight's event will be followed by a reception on the balcony. Since I have your attention, I wish to make a plug for a future exhibition in this reading room on November 3rd, preceded by dedication of the new she-wolf, Lupa statue. Yes, she's coming back, in Eden Park at 10 a.m. that day. And then the exhibition afterward in this library, featuring a video and photographs of the various stages in the making of the statue and the transport of it from Florence, Italy to Cincinnati. All thanks to the sons and daughters of Italy here in Cincinnati, representatives of which are in attendance tonight. And rare books featuring passages in Plutarch, Virgil, Ovid, Livy, and others, describing the story of how a wolf nourished the future founders of ancient Rome. And Roman coins depicting the story, one from as early as the 2nd century BCE. Now, in honor of Seneca, let the festivities begin. Professor Markovich.
Thank you, Rebecca. I would actually like to start by thanking Rebecca Lindau and my colleague Susan Prince on behalf of the department for organizing this event. Thanking our dear guests for coming here to be with us tonight, and everyone else in the audience for being with us this evening. There's actually nothing better that Seneca would have imagined for all of us. He keeps reminding us in the letters to Lasarius that the best thing we can do at any point in our life is to drop everything and study Stoic philosophy. So there will be a lot of that tonight. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our guests today. I will do that in alphabetical order, not very imaginatively, but fairly. And I will ask you maybe to greet all of them with one single round of applause in the end. So I will start with our moderator, Professor Kamesar, who is actually a well-known entity in the department, especially in this room where you can see his designated shelf in the back of the room. Professor Kamesar is a professor of Judeo-Hellenistic literature here at Hebrew Union College and Jewish Institute of Religion, just down the road behind me. He specializes in Philo of Alexandria and in biblical exegesis, that is to say the history of the translation and interpretation of the Bible in Greek and Latin. His scholarly work stands on the crossroads between Judaism, Hellenistic philosophy, or history of philosophy more broadly, and early Christianity. He has many publications, well known. He has edited relatively recently the Cambridge Companion to Philo, and I should also mention his book on Jerome, Greek scholarship, and the Hebrew Bible, which is a good example of his interests. He has been teaching Seneca at HUC for a while, and so many of our students in not so recent past have taken courses with him, many of our graduate students. Next to my left is Professor James Romm. He's a James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College in Annandale, New York. He's a publicly engaged intellectual and very eloquently promotes the idea of looking at our own predicaments, modern predicaments, through the lenses of ancient authors. His most recent books on Seneca include a translation of the work On the Shortness of Life, which he published under the title of How to Have a Life. This is preceded by a series of books similarly based on on Seneca's work, but with modern titles such as How to Keep Your Cool, right, which is on anger, in Seneca, How to Die, which is a compilation of different sources, How to Give, right, on beneficence. He's also interested in particular the 4th century, as I gather, Greek history, and has published recently monographs on Demetrius the Sacker of Cities, and also on the sacred band of 300 lovers, the famous sacred band. He publishes regularly articles and essays on classical authors in venues such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Review of Books, and the New Yorker. And these pieces, I think, especially from the Trump era, inspired Rebecka Lindau to no small extent to organize this event. Next, again to my left, so next to James Romm is Chris Trinacty, who is also a well-known friend of our department, visiting lecturer in the past, participant in our conferences, and also Titus Fellows, one of the Titus Fellows a couple of summers ago, if I remember correctly. He's a professor and chair of the Department of Classics at Oberlin College, so not far from us, and the focus of his interest is what I guess I would call Seneca Hall, because you're one of those people who actually work on the philosophical works and tragedy at the same time. You started from the tragedy, and your book on the Senecan tragedy and the reception of Augustan poetry is actually an exploration of the Augustan poets, particularly Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, as a thesaurus of diction and ideas for Seneca. From there, Professor Trinacty continued into writing commentaries on the natural questions, and there is a commentary on book 3 that is available online, and continued to write a commentary with a selection of readings on natural questions. He's very actively publishing, well known for numerous articles, book chapters, and also he's a devoted teacher at Oberlin and a speaker at various conferences, not the least here in Ohio. And finally, on Zoom, we have Professor Gareth Williams. Last but not least, Professor Williams is an Anton Professor of Latin Language and Literature at Columbia University in New York. He has written extensively on Seneca, both for students and for experts. Students will know, for example, his Cambridge Green and Yellow editions of the dialogues on leisure and on the shortness of life, and many chapters and various companions on Seneca. Scholars of Seneca will know him for also many articles and chapters, but particularly for the book on the cosmic viewpoint, which is a study of Seneca's natural questions. This book has won the prestigious Goodwin Award relatively recently. Professor Williams is also interested in classical and early imperial Latin poetry, and recently, I think very recently, he published this year a book on Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is his interpretation of the poem, but also a companion to modern readers who are interested in questions such as hate speech or resistance to autocracy and such. He's also a devoted teacher. I counted at least 3 awards for excellence in teaching that he has received at Columbia, and he's joining us today from New York City on Zoom. So please join me in greeting all our guests together. Kamesar to start the panel.
Thank you, Daniel, very much. And of course, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here, as always. And what I thought I'd do, we could start out with some very basic questions, and to give our audience also a sense of who the panelists are, and also for those who might have less experience with Seneca, of course, some introductory questions, and then at a certain point we would also open the floor for questions from the audience and proceed to maybe some more advanced questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out and ask each of the panelists to present some of the story of their own personal engagement with Seneca. And so what I'm asking is, within the context of your scholarly itinerary, how is it that you came across Seneca, and what were the points of interest that drew you to him? And are those points of interest the same today, or you would emphasize new ones in your current research? So I think we should. I had the idea that we would follow the order that's on the program, which was Professor Romm, Professor Williams, and Professor Trinacty, if that's okay. So it would be first to you, sir.
So, well, thank you, Adam, and thank you all for inviting me and making me welcome. I first encountered Seneca through his play Medea, because I was working on ancient geographical concepts, especially ocean. And those of you who know the Medea, you know that there's this amazing things about ocean taking revenge on the Argonauts for having crossed it, because the Argo was the first ship that crossed, through international waters, as we might say. And I was just blown away. This is like amazing tragic poetry. This guy's a philosopher? Wait, that doesn't make sense, right? Philosophers don't write tragic poetry, or if they do, they're not very good at it. So I was fascinated by the fact that he was both a tragedian and a philosopher. And then when I learned about his political career, it was, that added this whole other layer to his biography that I just couldn't get over. So I got into it through tragedy, but then when the different layers sort of aggregated, I thought, well, this is about the most interesting personality that I've ever come across in the ancient world.
And what about today? I mean, would you say that you sort of, do you still have those same interests, or in your current research or projects, maybe you might share with us what would you find elements that you might emphasize now, in 2023?
So I've, gravitated more toward the prose works. I guess, maybe typically with age, I've gotten more interested in moral philosophy. So the translations that Professor Markovich alluded to are, have been my most recent contact with Seneca. And of course, his prose works are so rich and but long. And some of them, too long. So, my volumes for Princeton have attempted to trim them down some. I think he does well in excerpted format, let's put it that way.
And how many of those are out now?
4.
Okay.
4.
Yeah.
And there's one now from Robert Castor that makes a fifth Seneca volume in that series.
And what's the topic?
That one is from a variety of works. It's called How to Be Good.
Okay.
So yeah, it's pretty wide ranging, and it selects from a number of his different prose works. Or How to Be a Good Person. I'm sorry, How to Be a Good Person.
Okay, so then can he see me, or
Gareth,
can you see me at all, or no?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so it's your turn. We want to ask the same questions of sort of, how you got interested in Seneca, and then maybe how things have evolved over time, and in terms of your interest and what you might emphasize to, on an audience like ours that are, maybe they're starting to get interested in Seneca, they're PhD students, things of this sort.
Well, I first got interested in Seneca in about 1985, and I walked into a bookshop, and I owe my interest in Seneca to a torn page on a book, because to my astonishment, the cost of books even in those days was monstrous, and R.J. Tarrant's commentary on Seneca's Agamemnon was in Heffer's bookshop in Cambridge at a remarkable £3 because it had a torn cover. So I hastily bought the book, and then to my astonishment, when I began reading it, I couldn't recognize the tragedian on the page, reconciling him with the philosopher I'd already begun to study. And my interest was initially sparked by my incredulity that the pen that could be so soothing in writing philosophical prose could be so agitated in writing very artful but hysterical verse. And so my interest began with a sense of unease about the gap, finding the gap between prose, sedation, and verse, frantic verse, delight, play, indulgence. And as time went on, I found a secondary realization as I spent serious time with Seneca. I lost loved ones, and topics such as on the shores of life became personally extremely meaningful to me, and I was drawn back to a commentary format. What sparked my commentary interest was the last English edition of A Major Planet, had been published in 1919 or so by J.D. Duff, a Cambridge scholar who produced a very interesting edition of On the Shortness of Life and a consolation to Elvia, Seneca's mother, for the loss of her son to exile. It was a very important timepiece that I found inspiring, because this commentary was written, of course, in circumstances where hundreds of thousands of young men were going across the Channel and getting shot to pieces in Flanders. And so the text, historically in the last century, had great meaning, which I did feel very strongly, and that fed into my own experience. But the key point I would want to make, and why now, today, in 2023, I still have a passionate interest in Seneca, is that when I first read him in my late teens, he meant one thing. When I was in my 20s, he evolved into another thing, as did Horace, especially Horace's Odes. Each decade that has been added on to the freight and weight of my life has brought a greater appreciation for the value of the texts as living instruments. And all I would suggest today, in my own lived experience, is that the texts have actually evolved and changed in their meaning and function and value. As I've got older, my life experiences have shifted, and the depth that they have given me, I feel so fortunate to have been able to grow with Ovid, with Virgil, with Seneca. I owe them so much in terms of a chance to grow and to observe their own habits of growth in life as well. That's all.
Very nice. I think that's in the pseudo-Heraclitus introduction to Homer. Isn't that where he says where you go through life with Homer in these various stages? So that seems similar to that. So, Chris, your turn. Same question.
Tough to follow. So I got into Seneca when I was an undergraduate with some of the other graduates that I met here, and I especially was interested in his tragedies. I wanted to study classics because I wanted to read Greek. I wanted to read Euripides in the original, and so when I started reading Euripides, I realized, Euripides is doing amazing things with tragedy and really pushing the envelope of what tragedy is. And then I opened up an edition of Seneca, and I thought, wow, he's doing it even more so than Euripides, and I want to spend more time with this guy. And so I went off to graduate school and started working on Senecan tragedy. At that time, I was much more interested in theater, in poetry, in the literary texture of those tragedies. I didn't even really care that much about Senecan philosophy, I'll be honest with you. I was young, and it didn't matter to me so much. But as I've gotten older, kind of like what Gareth and what Jamie said, I found that Senecan tragedy started speaking to me quite a bit more. I sort of put the tragedies aside and spent a lot more time on some of Seneca's prose works. I have especially been fascinated, in large part because of Gareth's book, The Cosmic Viewpoint, on Seneca's Natural Questions, which I think really speaks to maybe a lot of 21st century concerns about the environment, about man's place in the natural world, about how we think about ourselves in this world today. So that's some of my career arc as far as that goes, Adam.
Nice to hear. Okay,
Go
ahead, sure, go ahead.
Can I just add to my response, because none of the three of us brought it up, but I think, clearly one of the most relevant things about Seneca today is his accommodations to autocracy. And, not to get too political, but in the last administration, we saw a number of people who had to make very similar choices to the ones that Seneca had to make under Nero, and figure out how to navigate a corrupt regime in which he could ameliorate the regime if he were to stay with it, but staying with it required him to make terrible moral compromises. So I think, the political role that he played is perhaps the most relevant part of his story for me.
Okay, I do want to come back to that. I had that in mind actually, because I know that would be of great interest, contemporary interest. But I want to go on to something a little bit more basic, and that is, when we think about Seneca, he's involved he's important for so many different fields. So if we're thinking about maybe we don't have a regular recurring course on Seneca at the University of Cincinnati in the classics curriculum. You have to come to the Hebrew Union for that. But even, that's not going to last much longer anyway. But in any case, I thought that some people might be interested in some suggestions for beginning self-study of Seneca. So the issue is that Seneca is, he's tied to these different fields. And what I wanted to do was to ask each one of our panelists to tell us what they would emphasize in terms of basic knowledge that one might acquire in approaching the study of Seneca from 3 different disciplines of classical studies. And by that I mean ancient history and Roman history. And we're going to give that to Professor Romm. For Greek philosophy, we're going to give that to Professor Williams, though he also wants to comment on Latin literature. And then for Latin literature, we're going to ask Professor Trinacty for what would be the key areas as far as essentials as you're concerned to say, what do I need, where should I begin to gain some knowledge about these different fields if I want to study Seneca by myself? In other words, if I don't have a course, things like that, even bibliographical recommendations, things of that sort.
So, move on to the same order.
Same order.
It's like a poker game. I always have to bet first. Well, I'm not a Roman historian. I'm more a Greek historian. But of course, both in the Greek world and the Roman world, the problem of autocracy was huge. And the Roman imperial system was already mature in Seneca's time, but was also at a crossroads because of the advent of a second really bad emperor in the course of its first century, and the fact that the Senate was not yet totally cowed as a counterweight to the princeps. So Seneca's time was a time when the question of autocracy was still very much a live question. There was a sense that it might not have to be that way, and Seneca played a very ambiguous role, or a very he's been described as a time server, which is a term that we don't use anymore, but it used to mean someone who makes accommodations to whatever is going on at that time, that has to adapt to his time. And Seneca, unfortunately, made those accommodations. He was the first one to use the term king in speaking of the Roman emperorship. He uses it in the De Clementia speech that he delivered, or an essay that he wrote early on in Nero's reign. So he was basically trying to put the seal on the emperorship and declare it a permanent institution. Of course, later on he had second thoughts about that. But I think the study of autocracy and the Roman emperor as an institution is a crucial background for the study of Seneca.
So in other words, you would emphasize the, late Republic, early Empire, that somebody would focus on that as, let's say, as opposed to something in Greek history or another period of history. That would be the focal point.
Yes, because the Princeps was such a unique institution. It was not a king, it was not a dictator, it was not even an official office of any kind. It was an informal arrangement that no one quite knew how to define it. And no one was quite sure how long it would continue. So, yeah, all those things make it.
The institutional framework is what you're saying is how I would interpret that. I mean, for the, Roman constitutional history, things of this sort, to really understand the mechanisms. That's what I'm sort of hearing.
Exactly.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at Greek philosophy and ask Professor Williams about this. What would be the elements or the philosophers or the periods of Greek philosophy that you would stress to somebody who might want to undertake a self-study of Seneca? In other words, whether it be, Stoicism purely, or should they have Platonism, Middle Stoa, these kinds of subtleties.
Thanks, Adam. I'm not a philosopher, so in a way I shouldn't be talking about an area I don't know, but I will try this as a suggestion. One of the most important developments in Senecan study in the last 4 or 5 decades has actually been the rise of interest in Greek Hellenistic philosophy. Down to the 60s, the 70s in the UK and elsewhere, there was great emphasis on Platonism, of course, Aristotelianism, and Hellenistic philosophy tended to get the shorter end of the stick. That changed in the 80s into the 90s. As the rise of interest in Hellenistic philosophy arose, then consequentially a far greater earnest insight into the nature of Senecan philosophy really got going through scholars such as Burnam, etc. From a technical point of view, it is certainly very fascinating to watch the rivulets of influence flow down from Plato, through Aristotle, through the Hellenistic philosophers, the Stoics and the Epicureans who founded these fascinating systems of thought. But in terms of a first encounter with Seneca, I think that there is a more technical way to go and a less technical way to go. The more technical does take us into the weeds of what Seneca is doing at a highly proficient level, with details of Hellenistic philosophical practice. The less technical aspect offers a softer landing into a very complex area. And what I would suggest there is a good way into these questions is in fact to start with the very lucid writings of a modern scholar. His name is Pierre Hadot, H-A-D-O-T, a wonderful, wonderful French scholar who had the remarkable gift of explicating very complex material in a very lucid style. And he wrote a wonderful book that was then published in translation in 1995 called Philosophy as a Way of Life. And it offers such a good window onto very complex historical Greek philosophical developments and how they trickled down to formulate by Seneca's time in the 1st century CE philosophy not as a laboratory practice and not as a purely theoretical exercise, but how philosophy can actually function as a form of therapy, as a form of methodology to get us through life. What happened at Rome if you broke your leg? Well, there was no healthcare coverage. What happened if you had malaria? You don't. What happened if you were getting to 60? You're doing very well because of mortality. What happened if you lost your job? Well, if you're a slave, unfortunately, such systems existed in Greek and Roman antiquity, and you did not own yourself. In all these ways, we're so remote from ancient experience. Stoicism, Senecan Stoicism, philosophy as a way of life, actually functioned in ways that are difficult for us to imagine now, because we have a welfare state, because we have support systems to get us through this life. In that sense, I actually regard Seneca, while a very elite writer, using Greek philosophical ideas to do very important work to get us through this difficult life. It's no surprise that in the same age as Seneca was writing therapeutic philosophy, there was a rise of interest in in astrology at Rome, a rise of interest in magic at Rome, a rise of interest in Christianity and religious diversity at Rome. People are looking for systems to claim identity, to affirm dignity at the individual level, and to find a sense of value and self-worth in life. Seneca, in that sense, offers a very important commodity to suggest to each of us, if we are in the privileged position of being able to read him. Literacy in Rome is something like 14% at most. The privilege of reading Seneca is to be given a chance to form an identity in life and to form a meaning for our existence and to understand that we have value. That is a very crude attempt to grapple with a subject that's enormously large. I would suggest that Adult offers a wonderful window to begin accessing a very big picture.
Well, you know, his wife has that book on that same topic at a very advanced level, you know, this liblog for the psychologia. But what I wanted to ask you, do you think it's fair to say then that we could, when we think about Seneca and the way that you've described it, that would be the equivalent of, you know, our psychotherapist or our psychiatrist maybe? Is that, do you think that would be a fair way to put it?
There was a very interesting book by an English doctor called Robertson. It effectively, he's a therapist, a professional therapist. He wrote a book on cognitive behavioral therapy and illustrated it through casebook examples drawn from Seneca. It is a very interesting emergent process, partly tied up with what is going on in Exeter and the Stoic experiment under the very wise guidance of Christopher Gill, a wonderful academic expert. But there are many overlap possibilities, and professional therapists are very clear in seeing Seneca as doing proto-therapeutic work, so that in Robinson's book there is a natural flow over to modern cognitive behavioural practice. Barnes & Noble, if you want to walk into Barnes & Noble, there on the self-help shelf is Seneca alongside Marcus Aurelius. And was it not Bill Clinton who said that he really enjoyed having Marcus Aurelius on his bedside table?
Right. Excellent, wonderful response. And Chris, we'll come back to you for Latin literature.
So if you're interested in reading Seneca's tragedies, I think that to place them in their milieu is to really try to get a sense of what's happening during the Neronian period, which is a real response to the Augustan literature that happened in the previous generation. The Augustan poets, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, were fabulous in what they did, and I think Seneca's tragedies try to offer an amalgam of a number of those different poetic genres. So his choral odes will harken back to Horace's lyric poetry. Some of the long messenger speeches will feel like little mini epics, almost like Virgil's Aeneid. But at the same time, he's taking Greek mythological topics in these tragedies and really putting a Senecan spin on them. He's interested in the psychology of the characters. He's interested in autocracy. He's interested in unchecked power and unchecked passions. To read the tragedies, you don't necessarily get the sense of maybe the Stoic philosopher or the person interested in self-help in quite the same ways. You get a much maybe darker image of passion, of power, and yet it's all wrapped up in this wonderful Latin poetry. I would also say that, in reading Seneca, you could also turn to something. So in his tragedies, if you read the Medea, if you read the Phaedra, if you read the Thyestes, you're going to be wowed, I think, by these works. You're going to be shocked at times with what happens in them. And again, I think he's really doing interesting work in those tragedies. I think you could also read something like his Apocalyptosis, which is a funny work. So the pumpkinification is about the death of the Emperor Claudius and what happens after he dies. And he wants to go and become a god, because that's what Roman emperors should do. They should become gods, right? But the gods don't want to have anything to do with Claudius. And it's actually funny. It's kind of mean-spirited, but it's actually kind of funny to read. And so you get a really different sense of the way that Seneca can write. Seneca is multifaceted. He's offering different views of himself in these different works. I think sometimes we choose a Seneca in our mind, maybe at different times in our life, or to speak to different topics that we're interested in, but it's all embodied in him. When some of the things that we think about with Seneca is, oh my gosh, he was a hypocrite. But I actually think he's more just a man of contradictions, and he's willing to address those contradictions and try to speak to them, even if sometimes they are difficult maybe for us to wrap our minds around.
What would you say, let's say, is the reading of Greek tragedy more important as a preparation to Seneca, or would you point to any Latin author that you would say, in terms of understanding, Seneca in his contemporary literary setting, you should read so-and-so?
Yeah. No, so I think that if you read Greek tragedy, and if you read Euripides' Medea or Euripides' Hippolytus, you can, obviously make some interesting comparisons then with Senecan tragedy. Unfortunately, for so long, that's where basically Senecan studies ended, was, for hundreds of years, it was that you read the Euripides or the Sophocles, and you read Seneca, and you said, boy, Seneca doesn't really stand up to Sophocles' Oedipus, and so we're not interested in reading Seneca. And so he was denigrated as not being a Greek tragedian. I think he's doing something quite different. I think sometimes the purposes of harnessing those myths is for a different message altogether, and it's not for the same message as Sophocles' Oedipus, for instance. Seneca's Oedipus is a completely different beast, I think. If you do read those, and it will kind of help you get a sense of what ancient tragedy might be like, and how to think about it as a genre. But I tend to, I would almost say to find analogs within the Neronian period, such as Lucan, who's an epic poet writing at that time, who kind of gives us another view of, in that case, epic, but from a, if you will, a silver perspective, or that's like.
No, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one more question I wanted to ask about the self-study, and maybe we can do this more briefly, but what would be the works of Seneca if somebody wanted to, the newcomer to Seneca that you might suggest as where they should start, and maybe what might be some of the works where they should say, well, maybe that I should hold off on a little bit. And let's use you saying go in reverse order, and you start, Chris.
Oh, okay. There are plenty of fine collections of Seneca's works. The University of Chicago has recently translated all of them, so those are fine. I think that there is an excerpted version of the letters. There are 50 letters of Seneca by Margaret Graver and A.A. Long, and I think that's a great place to start. I think their notes are excellent. I think the introduction is excellent. I would go there if I was interested in thinking about Senecan self-study and kind of one-stop shopping for moral improvement. So that's the one I would go to.
And what would you say would be maybe the work you might want to hold off until you're maybe a little more proficient in whatever field to approach? Any actual questions, or?
I would say Dave Beneficiis, which is his long work on gift giving. While I think it's wonderful, I think that your version is probably the one that one should read. I would read Jamie's version.
It's been a real snoozer. No one has bought that. No one's interested.
Which is a shame, because again, it's actually there's some really fascinating material in that work.
No one wants to learn how to give.
No one wants to learn how to give in the 21st century.
Okay, let's go to Professor Williams. What would be your take on that same question?
Well, I think Chris is absolutely bang right. The Graver Romm edition of Senecan Letters, a very good introduction, because the beauty of letters is a 4-year course, liberal arts education. You begin at philosophy go through the collection, and it's very judiciously chosen, you move up to graduate level pretty quickly. Just to change gears though, obviously the lectures are very therapeutically involved on how one can work through one's own issues and developments in life. If I had to choose a Senecan work that would open him up philosophically and put him into conversation with modern philosophical practice, I would move away from the therapeutic tendencies in a way, and I would suggest his essay, short essay, on providence. Because in that text, he touches upon the eternal question of, if God is good, how come one suffers terribly in life? How can the sage be afflicted if we do live in a theocracy where God is good? And that text in particular, it seems to me to have such a cross-time resonance, because of course so many thinkers have grappled with the fundamental problem across the ages. And De Providentia on providence still, to me, stands up as a very important contribution to that timeless debate.
And anything you might say, well, maybe I should put that off until I'm a little more advanced in Senecan philosophy or whatever field might be.
Yeah, I think Jamie is quite right. The Biblical piece is fascinating, and offering a template for how we should, or obligations we should as a society owe each other as individuals. I think it does become instantly very complicated, though, because of course Seneca is writing in a slave society, which instantly complicates the whole idea of gift giving and service to one's fellow person. I stress person, not citizen. It obviously becomes very difficult. The natural questions is fascinating, but does get technical very quickly. Seneca does try to dilute the technicality as best he can, but Seneca, he does have a formidable edge to him sometimes, as I well know.
All right, Professor Romm.
Well, I would sort of turn this in a different direction and focus on the idea that I think is the most sort of central and accessible in Seneca, but not a single work. His focus on death. It's remarkable that he has no essay on death. He discusses it in many different essays and contexts, and in a sense it's pervasive, yet not concentrated in any one text. Seneca thought that life was a rehearsal for death, and that we should practice dying, and that we're dying every day, as my title has it. I tried to collect some of the most important passages in my Princeton volume, How to Die, and there's a wonderful chapter in the volume by Miriam Griffin, Seneca, A Philosopher of Politics, which is the comprehensive biography of Seneca, but unfortunately doesn't deal with the tragedies. But she has a chapter that deals with all of his thoughts on death. So if you want to grab hold of a central pole of his thought, I would go to one of those two places.
Isn't letter 70 or 71 the question of whether you should anticipate death or wait for it, where it is specifically dedicated to the question of suicide?
Yes. So there are individual letters that are devoted to that topic, and passages in all of the prose treatises. But it's hard to find if you're just skimming through Oxford classical texts or Oxford Old Classics translations. It's remarkable that he never devoted a single word to it.
Very good. Okay, I would like to ask a question that's a little bit more advanced, and then after I ask that question, and then we're going to open up the questions to the floor. Okay, and the question that sort of intrigued me always was in Tacitus's description of the death of Seneca, this famous death scene, which is in the Annals, I think it's book 15, chapter 62 and 3. He has this scene where Seneca is speaking with his friends, and the centurion arrives, and he says to him whether he could have access to his will so he could presumably change it and give these friends that were with him some assistance or benefits from the will. But he's denied that privilege. Seneca is denied that privilege by the centurion, and at that point Seneca says that he's bequeathing to him the image of his life, or the pattern of his life. And that would be what he is his gift to him. And my question was, would that be something that we think is a Tacitean touch, which is, because Tacitus, at the end of the Agricola, he says, that's what the famous expression, forma mentis, he tells the daughter and the surviving wife of Agricola that they needn't worry about the physical aspect of their father and husband, that they should focus on the forma mentis, which even has sort of this Platonistic coloring in terms of the vocabulary that's used. And so I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that, whether that might have been the aspect, whether that is part of what we have in the Tacitean passage, or can we actually lend any credibility to the scene based on what Seneca says about, especially Cato the Younger, when he says in On Tranquility, chapter 16, that he was this viva imago virtutium, or the living image of virtue. In other words, that he saw this person as like a model that could be emulated. And that's further explained in letter 95. So my question was, well, how would you see that? In other words, are those the only two options, or should it be explained in some other way? The death scene. And anyone can answer the question and can take their turn.
Well, I'll give it the first shot, but I'm really interested to hear what you guys have to say too. I think that I think when he's talking about the image of his life, I think there might be some Tacitean irony there, in the sense that I think for Seneca, he might say that the image of his life is actually what is in his works, what is in his writings, that is the image of his life. That is what he would want people to follow. That would be the example that he'd want people to follow, maybe more even than his actions. I think that there's
do what I say, not what I do.
Do what I say, not what I do. I mean, I think this moment is one in which if the proof is in the pudding, and he talks about death quite a bit, this is the moment when he faces death quite bravely. But I tend to think when he's thinking about himself as an exemplum, he's thinking about himself through his writings, and that would be the image of his life that he's maybe referring to more than necessarily the actions.
You discussed this in your book, that scene, so
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I don't know what to say about the two verbal parallels that you point to, but it's fascinating to try to discern the tone of the death scene as Tacitus relates it. It's a very extended death. Seneca has to use 3 different methods in order to kill himself. And this is a man who's thought about death his whole life, and has even planned for his own suicide because he had stored up a drink of hemlock so that he could die in the manner that Socrates died in Athens. Unfortunately, it must have gone stale or something because after he drank it, it didn't work. Tacitus cuts away in the middle of the scene and gives us some other information, and then comes back and says, and the death of Seneca was still going on. So there's a little bit of black humor in his narration of Seneca's death, and I can't quite tell whether he's poking fun at the idea of a man who thought his whole life about death yet didn't know how to do it, or if there's just kind of a whimsical but ultimately empathetic tone to the death scene. There's a movie that probably no one will ever see, and you're probably fortunate because it's really bad, but a movie was made last year with John Malkovich playing Seneca, and it was only released in Germany, and I was lucky enough to get a copy of it. But they spend about half an hour of the movie on Seneca's death. It's a tour de force for John Malkovich. He pulls out all the stops. But other than that, it's really bad. But you know, the filmmaker understood that that was the central moment for understanding Seneca, the suicide.
Gareth, anything you want to add to what's been said about that?
Well, I think Jamie, I fully agree with what Jamie said essentially, but I think it's important to bear in mind that Tacitus didn't really write with a stylus, he actually wrote with a stiletto. And we should expect him to write with a certain effect when it comes to Seneca, because Tacitus is so gently scathing about so many other characters in the Annals, for example. But death scenes have interested me for two reasons. The second reason is perhaps the quicker to deal with, and that is when Boccaccio rediscovered Tacitus, there was a very interesting point on which he dwelt, and that is that he felt that Seneca, in fact, in a moment of standing in the bath, was being baptized at death, because he was in fact a crypto-Christian, and he never really publicly declared his faith. It's a very interesting strand, which keys into another interest of mine, which is in the pseudo-correspondence between Seneca and St. Paul, a fascinating story in itself, which was taken up by people like Boccaccio with great gusto to demonstrate that Seneca was proto-Christian. The second point is to touch on the point made by Jamie. The Cato as go tutium viva imago point, as opposed to Seneca. The difference there is that in the text talking about Cato, it's Seneca who says Cato was gratuitium viva imago. It's one thing to call somebody else an imago gratuitus, another thing to call oneself an imago of virtue, etc., of one's life. I think that Tacitus, to me, with that right combination of delicate irony and cutting insinuation, is suggesting perhaps that Seneca is so practiced as a Stoic philosopher, he's written so copiously, that the Seneca at the end is desperately trying to live up to the script that he's been writing for decades. He's been writing about death, as Jamie so well said, and it's as if the dramatist is not just the tragedian. The dramatist in Seneca is ultimately the actor who is trying to follow the script of how you go about dying. So then the
notion of the icon is more of an ideal, you think, but we shouldn't lend any credence to that as a historical testimony from Tacitus. Or could he have really said that to his friend?
Personally, I don't believe myself that he would do so, because it does teeter on the cliff edge of pomposity.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, particularly when you compare it to the focus of the homologia that you get, in the letters, especially at that late period. On the correspondence of pseudo-Paul and pseudo-Seneca, Jerome clearly didn't believe that was authentic. I mean, as a stylistic expert, he knew that was phony. But the medievals maybe looked at it differently. I mean, they actually thought it was authentic.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Jerome surely should have realized that it wasn't authentic.
No, he did. He implied, it's clear from what Jerome says in that text, it's clear that he didn't believe it, because he says it circulates as, which is what he says about other authors, and he clearly doesn't believe it's authentic. So I would say you take that Jerome, and it's a negative vote on authenticity of of the Pauline pseudo-Senecan correspondence. Okay, but at this point, I'm open the questioning up to the audience, and anyone can ask a question, to a general question, or you can address your question to one of the three panelists.
Thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating so far, and I'm hoping to get some input from three experts in Seneca on a topic that I'm curious about, but I have not had the opportunity to pursue the text. Oh, thank you. So recently I've been working on a project with Pliny's Natural History, which is, of course, an environmental and natural science-based text that also displays significant Stoic influences. And I have been looking at whether or not Pliny could be considered a proto-environmentalist. And I'm curious whether, if you look at Seneca's Natural Questions, that is a avenue that could be pursued. Would Seneca appear to be a proto-environmentalist in this work?
Well, I think Gareth is probably the one to talk to this specifically, and he has been in his book about Pliny and Seneca. I think that, so I'm going to defer to you, Gareth, on this one.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
And so, just briefly, I think that there are definitely passages in Pliny that will lend itself to that thesis and that you can compare with Seneca. Pliny's obviously huge. Pliny wrote 37 books, and a lot of that nitty-gritty there is going to be difficult to maybe work into a thesis about environmentalism. But I think there's probably some there that you can very ably place next to Seneca to create an argument. Yeah. Gareth, what about you? What do you think?
Well, to my mind, I think what's very fascinating about the Plinian end is that the question of the extent to which Pliny's Natural History is a Stoic work is very fascinating, not least because it shows that by the later 1st century CE, the conversation about what constitutes a Stoic text is getting messy and fraying around the edges. Yes, there are very clear Stoic symptoms in Pliny, but there's much that isn't so easy to categorize as straightforward Stoic. And I just wonder whether intellectual categorization gets messy at this stage. As for the natural questions, I think there is clearly an understanding beneath the text that it does presuppose a Stoic universe based on the systematization of the four elements, air, fire, earth, and water, which is fundamental. Of course, the elements are fundamental to other philosophies, but they're dealt with by the Stoics in a very particular way. It's just 2 points. One is, the theory goes that humans breathe pneuma, a combination of air and fire. We breathe elemental air. For a Stoic, we have responsibility for the world environment because we breathe the elemental motivating force of that environment. We are not separate from it. We are fundamentally attached to it. And as an extension of that thought, all of us as human beings breathe the same air. Therefore, theoretically, categorizations such as one nation or another nation, slave or free, falsify what is a natural human condition. Something like the United Nations is a very Stoic organization in one sense, because it does at least attempt to create a common bond of humanity across cultures, across borders, etc., in a very Stoically refined theoretical way. And so both environmentally and even ethically, it seems to me, Stoicism has a lot that does reverberate in modern political and modern eco thinking.
Another question. Anyone else has a question? Or a question about the political, the question of the contradictions between Seneca and his involvement with the princeps and the Stoic philosophy in contrast. Did anyone want to ask about that? Yes.
Thank you very much. I work with Seneca's strategies, and this is something I have almost questions. I'm almost wondering, to what extent can we say that Seneca's politics is a kind of commentary on real politics?
big question. And they clearly seem to reflect the times to some degree without necessarily wanting to. I think not many people would want to say, "Oh, Phaedra, that's a stand-in for Agrippina," or something along those lines necessarily. That sort of one-to-one identification. But a work like the Thyestes, which is usually dated pretty late, usually dated to the Neronian period, you've got lots of ways in which you could kind of map that onto even Seneca, himself. If Thyestes was in exile and was saying a lot of kind of vaguely stoic things, and then comes back to share power with his brother, and sort of turns his back on the simple philosophical stoic life, and ends up being punished, if you will, for it in some way, right? So is that Seneca looking back at his own career in some way and thinking about what he's done? So I think there are ways in which tragedy, can be political. And clearly during that time period, there are other tragedians saying, that they're writing these tragedies and they're meant to criticize the emperor. And so that is there. But Seneca's a pretty smart guy. I don't think he's going to do anything that's going to be, that's going to be able to, so that, he's going to put someone in Nero's mask or something like that on stage. Jamie, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the Thyestes is, to my mind, is inextricably linked to the experience under Nero, to the Seneca's experience under Nero. But you can't prove it. There's nothing hard and fast. It's just the tenor of the play. We don't know whether his plays were put on or even circulated during his time. I'd be interested to know what my fellow panelists think about that. But if they weren't put on, that suggests that he could say things in them that had political resonance and yet not get in trouble for it. That is, they were more or less private documents for himself and a close circle of friends. That would put them in we'd be able to read them differently than if we knew they were staged.
Do you have time for one more, do you think?
Yeah, it seemed to me early on there was some mention of the relevance of Seneca to contemporary political problems with the last deplorable administration. And I think of John Kelly, and I think of General Milley, and I think back earlier Admiral Stockdale. Are you really suggesting that the way in which Seneca behaved when he was serving Nero is like they're doing it, or was it more hypocritical than I think they were doing? My understanding of Kelly's role as chief of staff was he really did think that Trump was despicable, but that he was going to try and save Trump from doing terrible things. And the same with Milley, right? He might have started the war with China or something like that. But Nero, it seems to me, is more ambiguous. I don't know enough about him, and I've got Griffin's biography, but I haven't read it yet, and I don't know what to say. But what are you saying about the connection between Seneca's activity when he was in the service of Nero and people in the last administration that kept us from perhaps the worst stuff, which will happen if the bastard wins again, right? That's what I want to get to.
Well, we have mostly Tacitus's testimony that Seneca tried to talk Nero out of certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, he is in a parallel role to Kelly and the other fellow. That he stopped him from performing on stage as a singer. Not a human rights abuse, but something which would have brought the Principate, the office of princeps, much lower into a debased condition as he saw it, and would destroy the dignity of the office. tried to stop him from raising chariots, which Nero desperately wanted to do. I grappled with this question a lot in Dying Every Day, and I tried to see it in both lights, that yes, Seneca made terrible moral compromises, had to collude in terrible crimes, but ultimately was doing it for the good of the state, that he could make the regime a better regime if he stayed with it. Ultimately, he tried to leave it, much to his credit. He offered to give Nero back all of his wealth and buy his way out if he could just leave and go quietly into retirement. And Nero didn't allow him to do so. So he deserves a lot of sympathy, even though he also disappoints us in his political role.
Thanks.
We did have another question, yes.
First off, thank you so much for this presentation. I really enjoyed this today, especially as someone that's from outside of the field, so it's been very enlightening for me. I did have two quick questions, if that's okay.
I think could Rebecca, can we allow that?
Yeah, they're quick. First off, in bouncing off of this last question, I just wanted to get to the point, especially as those today, as it's very pertinent today in academia, or in classics, or this idea of studying something that's very far away from the modern day. How do we convey to not only those higher up, supporting our jobs and with college, but also to our students that what we're talking about is important, and why should they fund our positions, but also why should they be studying this? How can we do that? You touched on that just a little bit, Professor Romm. And then also I wanted to get into this idea, through this idea of stoicism, but also with my work it does deal a little bit with this idea of the sort of history of emotions and this emotional systems, how they can come about and change with sort of a performance. My work is on actually in pre-modern and 12th century, much more recent, sorry, not in 2nd century. Anyway, and I was just curious about this idea of talking about Seneca and this very turbulent time in his life, and just wondering if in his own philosophy, if you've been able to see in his philosophy sort of a change from his earlier works to the later periods. And I know that seems, almost, of course there was, but just because within these sort of emotional systems and the way in which we convey it, it's typically, we could think of it as being in response to a drastic event, or in the sense of the ideas of emotions themselves causing ways in which our emotions shape. So just curious if you could elaborate on that a bit, just in your own research, what that shift has been like, how you've observed that. Thank you.
Gareth, you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, I think I caught the gist of it. I'll go. The second strand of it, as I understand the question, is to what extent is there an evolution of his philosophical thought? Again, it's a very complex and well-taken question. What I would suggest as an initial answer is this. Seneca was a sickly young man, had to go to Egypt to try to fortify his strength earlier on, and at that point also he was philosophically uncertain about direction, and he played with different affiliations before he finally found Stoicism as something that drew him. What's interesting to me is that in the 20s and the 30s CE, he can be seen to be writing piecemeal philosophy, at least the works that can be dated, which show him to be testing the ground, taking a limited philosophical idea and pressing it fairly thoroughly in a given limited span of work. To me, as he ages, develops political experience, he begins to see the overlap of his life and his philosophical thought, and he becomes much more adventurous in terms of his appetite for very strong, ambitious philosophical thinking. His projects get bigger. Indeed, his writings get bigger. The David, I think he's, 7 books, the NQ, the Natural Questions, and 8 books. It's as if there is a growth of ambition scaled to a deepening of life experience and, of course, intellect, and the ability to learn more as texts opened up to him himself. So I, for one, probably would suggest that there is a deep maturation and also an artistic poise that develops over time as he understands that practice through delivering the art in his Latin becomes something that at first he's tentative with, and then affirms, then develops, and finally in the 60s, the mature artist is basically a philosophical rampant.
But it's interesting that his last great magnum opus, the Letters to Lucilius, is not among his most widely read. None of us here have, well, you guys recommended the 50 letters from the excerpted version, but the entire work is so massive and so long that it's really kind of unreal.
I mean, it's wonderful. The letters are wonderful.
They do have a full translation out now, that includes all the letters.
Yeah.
So it is available in paperback. But I think we have to end it there, but we want to